Well, I'm glad you could make it. Welcome to the Dungeon series. This is a mini-series dealing with the initial launch aspects of Endgame for Guild Wars 2, the dungeons. The explorable paths of the dungeons, not the story ones, which of course I've already shown off. This series is meant to be a companion piece to the exhaustive and comprehensive Let's Play series I've just finished that saw me create 5 new characters and take them through the game, beating the Elder Dragon Zaitan at the end. So players at that point had to ask themselves what to do next, and for many that meant making legendary weapons. And legendary weapons meant getting money, resources, currencies and gifts for the Mystic Forge. You got those from the explorable dungeon paths. Explorable paths were the opportunity to return to the story mode dungeon locations to see the fallout of those environments after the main heroes of Destiny's Edge had passed through. We're going to be seeing what those stories are. In many cases, they're not that interesting, but particularly when you get to the last dungeon, Ara, you'll see things really ramp up and become vital for future stories. But beyond that, we're also going to look at the mechanics of the dungeons, which a lot of players don't really know about, because you can beat them so fast these days, and people become so efficient at beating them and skipping through aspects of them, that a lot of the most interesting elements will be completely alien to you, experienced player or new. And just like with the main playthrough I just finished, I want this set of videos, this bonus series, to be somewhat definitive. In that spirit, here at the start, I have just got to show you guys an interview from 2011. So this is before Guild Wars 2 came out, and the developers were laying down their philosophies and goals for the MMO. Guild Wars 2 in so many ways was trying to break the trends of other MMOs in terms of its delivery of dynamic events, a personal story that was supposed to honor your individual decisions. And it's true that with Endgame 2, which was going to be such an important part of this game, as when players beat things, that was what would keep them hooked, they also were looking to innovate. And the information they offer here about their intent is just too important to miss out on. It underpins everything about why the things we're about to play are the way they are. You can find the interview I've chosen from a guy called Ruben Waters, a clear Guild Wars 1 fan, in the link down below, but there were many articles from this period very similar. And in fact, when they started doing press about this, they also released about 8 minutes of very shaky cam combat footage previewing supposedly the dungeons themselves. I'll roll that footage of the dungeon we're about to play in the background. So what's going to be really fun here is, as Ruben asks questions and gets answers, try to think very carefully and remember what the dev answers are, because we're going to be seeing through this series just how closely what they were going for mirrors the actual game in the end. And once we're done, we're going to look back at this, and I think it's safe to say your mind will be kind of blown. So, Ruben asks, in terms of difficulty and group content, how do dungeons factor into Guild Wars 2? Could they be compared to any of the Guild Wars 1 zones players might be familiar with, like the Fissure of Woe, the Underworld, or even Slaver's Exile? To which the game director at the time, a man named Colin Johansson, says, the dungeons we have for Guild Wars 2 come in 2 modes. The story mode is basically pick-up group friendly. They're difficulty-wise balanced for 5 random players, and those tell the story of Destiny's Edge, the guild from the book Edge of Destiny. And when you finish the story version of a dungeon, you unlock the explorable version of that dungeon. Those are intended to be the super hard, very coordinated, group-style content like Slaver's Exile, or Fissure of Woe, or the Underworld. One of the things we've done with those is, like Slavers, had a very specific path that you're going through it, and there are always lots of different ways you could approach it, but at the end you are headed in the same direction. With the explorable dungeons, when you get into it, you get to vote on which path you want to go down as you progress through it. There are different paths that you can take, and each path provides you with completely different content. So you can come back and play the same dungeon for the same rewards, but experience it in a different way, so that you're not having to do the same content over and over and over again. Then, we've taken the dynamic events from the persistent world, and we've hidden them in the dungeons, and they have all sorts of different triggers that can happen. Some of them are a random percentage chance. So, for example, you could be going through the Ascalon Catacombs, and you'll go through it and defeat it, and you have a random event where you run into a giant spider boss, and you put a torch out in a hall that makes a ghost army come out, so that you get to experience that stuff. Another time through, you might be walking down a hall and a wall bursts open and a giant cave troll, Kool-Aid Man, comes out of the wall and stands in the middle and comes after you. The idea is that every time you play this, we want to surprise you and present you with stuff like that, so it feels like, I used this analogy a couple of weeks ago, but it's totally true, when I go dungeon running in a D&D game, the things that make it a dungeon to me are those random events that are happening. Like, you're headed down a hall and enter a trap, or a boss comes out of nowhere, and it's all about solving that stuff, and that kind of Indiana Jones style solving puzzles. So Ruben comes back and says, that's one of the hallmarks of a good dungeon master, the ability to come up with those interesting things to throw at you and either catch you off guard or surprise you in some way when you're not expecting it. Colin says, absolutely, and we feel that's what our explorable dungeons have to be really exciting for groups to play through them over and over again. We really want people to play them like Fissure of Woe or Slaver's Exile, where you're playing them a bunch of times in a row, and the best way to make that an awesome experience is so you know the basics of what you're going to experience. You have a lot of different ways you can choose to do it, and each time you do, we throw different things at you, so it feels like you never really know what's going to come. Like you're always on your toes playing in your best D&D game. Ruben says, in that explorable mode, it's all considered to be a set difficulty level though, correct? And Colin says, all three paths are equally difficult, and they end different ways usually too. Some of them will end at the same boss, which you play differently. For example, the Ascalon Catacombs dungeon that we've already shown a little bit of it on, in the explorable version of that, all three of them end with you fighting a giant graveling patriarch. But the way you fight them is three completely different ways. You could pick one path where you turn yourselves basically into ghosts and you trick War Master Grast and his ghost friends to join you as you lead an assault against the Patriarch. That's a completely different ending than one of the other chains where maybe you set up a trap for the Graveling Patriarch and you get a bunch of cannons and everything and you lead him into a room and get to unload on him. So each one has a very different ending. So even in that case, it feels different, but you're fighting the same boss at the end. But there's definitely equal difficulty on each of those paths. That's one of our design goals. So there isn't that situation where you go, let's take the right path, that's the easy one. And the dynamic events help with that too, because you can always have those happening on any path. Ruben says, will there be any NPCs outside of story mode that you'll encounter within the dungeons? I suppose one of the closest things that springs to mind might be some of the quests you can do within Sorry's Furnace that can only be obtained within that zone. Colin says, yes, definitely. It varies very greatly from dungeon to dungeon. For example, in the Ascalon Catacombs one I was talking about, the whole first part of it is fighting your way up to a Dermond Priory camp. And when you get there, you're presented with 3 plans of how to catch the Graveling Patriarch. There's an Asura who presents a plan, a Char who presents a plan, and a human who presents a plan. They tell you they'll need you to make a decision to vote which way to go, and you pick whose plan you want to pick. Whichever one you pick, that character comes with you for the rest of the dungeon, and is actually an active combat part of the dungeon for you. They're going to be telling you lore and talking about stuff that you experience as you go through it. But there will definitely be some of that kind of thing you mentioned from Sorry's Furnace. A lot of that is definitely going to come through the dynamic events that will occur within the dungeons. So you may, for example, have one where you're walking down a hallway you've never been down before, and at the end of the hall there's a guy stumbling towards you, and he's being chased by a horde of creatures. If you manage to save him, potentially he unlocks another dynamic event somewhere in the dungeon you couldn't get otherwise. There are going to be characters like that persist through all the explorable dungeons. Sometimes they'll be there and sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll be in areas you would never think to go. Maybe you'll pull a torch on the wall and that opens a secret door and you go into a room and there's a guy who's been hiding in there for 30 years because he's too scared to get out of the dungeon. Those kinds of characters are going to be mixed in there too. Ruben says, will there be anything that's maybe the equivalent of the PvE-only skills from Guild Wars 1, like Light of Delgemore, that will ping hidden things on the map to help you discover some of the event content? Colin says, right now we don't have plans to do anything like that. Instead, we want them to be world interactions. So you're doing things like pushing on a wall in a fireplace and find a secret exit in it. We want it so everyone can discover that stuff. So you don't need to bring one specific thing to do it. Everyone can do it, and they're doing it based on their own ingenuity and sense of discovery. There might be some bundle items scattered around the dungeons you can pick up. Like, you might find half a stick, and when you get half a stick, you could stick it in a wall and try to pry something open. But it won't be something that you need to build ahead of time and need to bring with you. Ruben says, so maybe we'll be able to find more jars of bees. Just a little note from me making the video. He's saying this because around this time, people were learning about the Jars of Bees event in Queensdale with the bears, and I guess we're enthusiastic about it. Colin says, yeah, that's a great example. Maybe you throw a jar of bees at a creature, and he runs away and smashes through a wall and opens up a new portion of the dungeon you've never seen. Ruben says that would be awesome, and Colin ends by saying that would be cool. In fact, I'm going to go back and talk to somebody about that real quick. So, there you have it. That's what the devs were going for with this content. It sounds smart, right? They were clearly conscious of the fact that this was going to be the content people would be playing a lot of, so it had to be able to surprise you and be divergent and interesting, even on subsequent playthroughs. They weren't confident that the thrill of the combat and buildcraft in the game alone was enough to keep things interesting. They wanted to prop it up with dynamic events randomly triggering around the dungeons, meaning rare stuff can happen and surprise you even on many playthroughs down the line, and also giving big branches through the dungeons known as explorable paths. All about equal difficulty, all offering the same general rewards, but it's your choice which one you want to see on that day. Lastly, they were very clear in this interview and all the others on their ideas for difficulty. That story would be for pugs and easy pickup groups, but these, the explorable ones, were brutally difficult for coordinated groups, for guilds and dedicated players. This was not content for casual play, which ArenaNet knew couldn't be the entirety of the experience, and knew a good portion of Guild Wars 1 players were looking for that difficult, challenging stuff, such as the dungeons Ruben themselves, even in this interview, mentions several times. That's what they set out for. Now let's go see how well they did. And in fact, starting with the Ascalon Catacombs, clearly the earliest one in development that had a lot of work done on it, even by the time of this interview, and the first one on the list, located at level 30 in the plains of Ashford. Okay, wait, one quick edit. I can't help myself before we jump in. Obviously, before the game came out, the novels were releasing too. We had two. In the novels, there were maps of Tyria, and they were glimpses of what the game world might look like before we actually got to log in. Several of them had landmarks as well, so check this out. You can see Kryta there, the ruins of Ur. You'll also notice that there are some small black squares dotted around, such as here in Ascalon. Oh look, the Ascalon Catacombs. Well, that's a dungeon, isn't it? If we look in the southern Shiver Peaks, another dungeon is marked, Sorrow's Embrace. If we cast our eyes to Ur, you'll see Arar is there. But what's this? Over in the Maguma Wastes? Well, two more black squares, two more dungeons. We have Bloodstone Fen. Guild Wars 1 fans will recognize that as a location. And we also have the Ruins of Denravi. Two potential dungeons the devs did have plans for in the game. We never had any press about them, for what it's worth, that seem to have ultimately been cut and replaced instead with one that's missing from this map. Yes, that would be Twilight Arbor, to do with the Nightmare Courts. This might offer some hints as to why the Carrion story was so contracted, why Foul Lane was such an underutilized story point for core. Maybe it's because Twilight Arbor was added actually quite late, and the devs didn't have time to really go very far with a lot of its elements. Particularly remember this map, and the fact that they were going to do a Ruins of Denravi, the Henge of Denravi, to do with druids and oak hearts, when we get to the episode in Twilight Arbor for this bonus mini-series, because you might just discover they combined content from the missing dungeon into TA. But that'll be a story for a little bit later down the line.